Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
No problem. I wish I had more of your books that should be in my store.
Okay, cool.
I have more coming. I'm just waiting.
It's all good. All good.
But I do have book plates if anybody's interested in, at least getting your signature while you're here.
Okay, cool.
So,
Cool.
well, hopefully I don't have any books.
Well, a lot of the students have books, so yeah.
For the most part,
Yeah.
usually happens. Well, most of them.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Great, thank you. Should I just sit here? Okay. Oops.
Two different times. So I'm going to go by my iPhone. I don't want to
Okay.
start early.
Right.
There'll be people.
Will you take a couple pictures while I'm
Yes,
up
I
there?
will.
Okay. Okay.
I wouldn't if you hadn't asked me to, because I feel I never know if people want it or not.
Yeah, I don't mind a couple photos. You can
I think I'd rather. Maybe I should sit farther back and get some people in the.
it's all good. It's all good. Yeah, if you could get a picture, that'd be great. Maybe a horizontal one too.
I can go a couple rows back. Did John tell you he's got a review books they're supposed to write tomorrow?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned it. It's all right. Such is life.
He's got a copy of it. A lot of these people have.
Yeah.
Have it on. Hey everybody, welcome. Glad to see you here tonight. Welcome to the 58th year of the Brockport Writers Forum. I'm glad to see you on campus at SUNY Brockport in Seneca Country. I am Jim. I work on this series with my friend Austin Bush, and something that I love about this job, there's a couple things I love about it. One is I get to bring in writers whose work I like to hang out with us on this campus, but another thing I love about it is that it's a chance for people who know each other to get together in the same room for a while. So I'm glad you guys are here. Don't run off after the reading. What's going to happen is Jack will read and talk for a bit. Then we'll have time for your questions. Hello to the people that are watching us on the live stream. In order for people on the live stream to hear your questions, you'll need to speak into this microphone. So just raise your hand and I'll run around with the mic. And then after the Q&A, Jack will sign books. Our friend John Bonzik is here from Liftbridge Books. He's got copies of Jack's books, and he also has the ability to get more copies of Jack's books. So hang around after the reading, and let's say hi to each other. 3 weeks from tonight, on October 15th, is our next visitor, Justin Murphy, author of Your Children Are Very Greatly in Danger. So come back for that. Jack Wang is originally from Vancouver, Canada. His first book, the story collection, We Two Alone, won the 2020 Danuta Gleed Literary Award for the best debut collection in Canada. And those stories go all over the world. Canada, the US, South Africa, Austria, and across a century following the lives of Chinese immigrants in diverse times and places. His work is rich with historical fact and also with the imagined lives of people and their relationships. His new novel, The Riveter, received award fellowships from both the New York State Council for the Arts and the Canada Council for the Arts, and has been published in both Canadian and U.S. editions. Jack is a professor of writing at Ithaca College, and he is also the co-creator of Star Wars Epic Yarns, a series of board books retelling the first 3 Star Wars movies beautifully in felt. Welcome to Brockport, Jack Wayne.
Thank you very much, Jim. Can you all hear me? I understand my mic is hot. Is it, in fact? Good. I'm delighted to be here at SUNY Brockport, just doing the interview and hearing the opening. It's a very, clearly a very illustrious forum or series, and it's just an honor to be here. So thanks so much, Jim, for inviting me. Had a delightful dinner right before this and a delightful class with the students. So just thanks all around. I'm going to read from the very beginning of the novel, from the prologue. And because it's from the very beginning, I really don't need to preface this reading, I don't think, at all. So I'll just launch into things. By the way, I'm going to read and then I'm going to show you some historic photographs to contextualize the book a little bit and my own research. And then I'd be happy to take questions, including any more from the class. The Riveter, prologue. For their final meal, the men had feasted on mutton and pork, and now they were sorry. All that food sat roiling inside them as their transport plane, an Albemarle, pitched and rolled in the dark. A night of buffeting winds, plus the wash of other Albemarles flying in formation. Every so often the plane would drop and their stomachs would lurch. During field exercises, the same man had always been first to retch, but in an unusual show of restraint, he had traded his dinner for cigarettes. Now they all waited to see who would do the honors instead. The men had to squat on the floor of the cabin under the weight of all their gear, the parachutes and the leg kit bags, every conceivable pocket crammed full of ammunition. With every dip and roll, they fought to stay upright. The whole plane roared with the gargling drone of the engines and stank of oil and gas and human tinctures, body odor, bad breath, and effluvium from all that mutton and pork, not to mention a miasma of cigarette smoke. Soon, it would smell even worse. Josiah Chang had an iron stomach, but even he had to close his eyes to settle the waves of nausea. In that more complete darkness, he pictured her face, or tried to, a face he knew so well yet somehow seemed to be forgetting. She had thin brows and heavy lids and dimples like wounds. Yet each time he tried to train his mind's eye, her features eluded him, darting away like minnows. He wasn't here for king and country, but for her. The plane continued to buck and bounce, a tin can batted around by a bear. The men felt green, swirled like flasks. It was only a matter of time before someone lost it, and sure enough, someone did, though it wasn't clear who. And the spatter and the taint and the endless motion proved too much for the man beside him, and the one after that, and so came the chain reaction, men falling like dominoes, until the whole cabin was filled with a violent gastric stench. Only a few managed to find their air sickness bags in time. As the plane staggered, runnels of vomit slid across the floor. When the gruel lapped his boots, Josiah tasted bile, but managed to choke it down. The Albemarles flew in threes, arrowheads whistling through the dark. Arrow upon arrow, one after another, a magnificent storm, an armada. To avoid detection, they flew low, skimming the ocean. To achieve surprise, they had shied away from the target before wheeling around and taking an indirect approach, prolonging the flight. Men were cramping, their muscles on fire. They longed to stand, to stretch out the pain, to throw themselves out of that fuselage with all possible haste. From somewhere came the distant sound of thunder. The floor door opened, letting in a bracing rush of air, the cleansing breath of God himself, which meant they were nearing the coast of France, Normandy. The plane began to shed altitude. Every man was alone now in the silent vault of his skull, indulging whatever gave him succor, memory, prayer, incantation. Josiah thought of her, wanted desperately to see her again. But even if he made it through this, would she still be his? Outside, kettle drums sounded, a menacing overture, and the windows began to flash white. The fighter escort had engaged, the whining dive of engines, the prattle of machine gun fire. And all the while, those drums, boom, boom, boom. The red light came on, casting its oddly sensual glow. The jump master ordered the men to hook up, and they clipped their static lines to the cable that ran the length of the cabin. Josiah was at the back of the plane, 10 out of 10 in the stick. He would be last man out. The sky began to fill with bursting black clouds of anti-aircraft fire. To the forces already battering them, the wind and the wash was now added the spanking of flak. The plane jounced, and pieces of shrapnel tore through the cabin, through the tender membranes of the floor and the ceiling, leaving holes that emitted weird beams of light. But somehow, no one was hit. In the carnival of chance that was war, their luck was holding. But the crucible was getting hot, and pilots were already panicking, peeling off or climbing away from danger. This wasn't going to be the orderly drop of exercises with the maximum number of men in the smallest possible space. No, they were going to be scattered all over the fucking place. But their pilot was holding steady, obeying orders. His only concession to fear was speed. He wasn't slowing down, at least not yet. Still, Josiah felt himself sending the man a badge of respect. At last, the light turned green, and the jump master yelled, "Go!" And the first man dropped down into the void, then the next and the next, from alternating sides of the hatch. Through the windows, Josiah saw the familiar bloom of jellyfish, a massive swarm in the strobing light. It was all he could do to keep cadence, not push and shove and bum rush the door, just to be out there. Halfway through the stick, the plane got rocked. The men good and tossed. Josiah's helmet struck something hard. Men fell over each other, tangled like marionettes, their static lines crossed. After yelling and screaming, unhooking and rehooking, they made for the hatch and threw themselves out. The exit cadence shot to hell. The three men before him, Gordon, Peavy, and Arsenault, left the plane in quick succession, not so much jumping as being sucked out, the plane still going full tilt. They were 19 and 20 years old. Never saw a camera that wasn't worth mugging for. Josiah would never see them again. He lumbered to the hatch with his leg kit bag, air gushing and howling all around him, pushed his static line at the jumpmaster and waited for the slap on the shoulder. Instead, the engines revved, the plane rose, and the jumpmaster shoved him back. "We passed the DZ," the jumpmaster shouted. "We have to go back." Josiah stared, bewildered. To England? No, back to the DZ. His mind reeled. They were going to circle back? Do all that again? At that moment, the plane was rocked a second time. Josiah was slammed to one side and fell on his back, head snapping against the floor. After blinking at the ceiling, those holes winking with light, he managed to get to his knees, but the jumpmaster was nowhere to be found. He had fallen through the hatch. The windows flickered orange and the cabin filled with thick black smoke. Only now did Josiah understand why their training instructor had made them practice blindfolded. With his eyes closed, he groped for the floor door on his hands and knees, choking on burning oil and metal. The plane was banking, and he struggled for purchase, slipping on gruel. When he felt the blast of air, he stretched out his arms, caught the lip of the hatch, and flung himself out. He was carried away on the slipstream, the tail of the Albemarle passing overhead, heading to some unknown fate. He had fallen out the wrong way head first. Nonetheless, he felt the tug of the static line, followed by a more voluminous jerk, which slowed him considerably. With his hands on the risers, he gazed up and inspected the chute, its edges scalloped, its ribs perfectly formed. Everything checked out. For a moment, as he drifted, all that drumming, the whole mad symphony, seemed to fall away, leaving only a whistling silence. It was almost beautiful. The orange blossoms, the orange tracers, a light show just for him. Then, in the faraway bloom of jellyfish, he saw two tangled parachutes whirling like a dervish as they plummeted. He snapped to. He reached for his quick-release straps and felt his right leg joyously freed of weight. When the leg kit bag reached the end of its 20-foot rope, he felt a hard yank, followed by an unexpected lightning. Unlike most, Josiah hadn't crammed his bag full of extra gear, extra ammo, extra rations. Nonetheless, his kit had torn clear through the bag and was gone. He only had a moment to rue the loss. The ground was fast approaching. He checked his drift, scanned for hazards, but the world below was one dark mass. With 100 feet to go, he thought he saw the boskage they'd been told to avoid, the trees and shrubs that edged the open fields, but he looked to be in the clear. He was coming in hard and fast. He clamped his feet, pointed his toes, hit the ground with a somersault, and popped right up on one knee, all his senses alive. He was down. Come back to bed. There were any number of ways she could have said this, drowsily, sulkily, wantonly. But she said it mournfully from a canyon deep inside her. Morning light sieved in, powdering the room. He'd been sitting on the edge of her bed for what seemed like hours, staring at his uniform, his woolen green battle dress and maroon beret, staving off the moment he would have to put it on and catch 3 planes and 2 trains for Camp Shiloh. A trip of days, and he had no more to spare. "I have to go," he said, his back still turned. A draft entered the room and a space opened between them. They stayed like that, taking each other's measure, until she said, "You should never have left." Here they were at last, her real feelings, feelings she had managed to fend off for a few days of concord, happiness. Last night she had put on the evening dress she had worn the first time he saw her sing, just to stay in, the two of them dancing to records in her living room, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, and he couldn't believe how the music, the clap of a hi-hat, the swoon of strings, could rouse her, possess her, and rivet him with feeling. Now that was over. The space between them yawned. I had to. No, you didn't. I would have married you. Her words, their particular construction, lanced him. And then what, he asked. I have to make things right. You know I don't care about right, she said, with the candor by which she lived her whole life. Well, I do. The words came out hot, a retort. He hadn't meant to sound so curt. Her voice rose to meet his. I'm not going to sit around and wait forever. That's not what I agreed to. I know, he said, though he hadn't known. His back was still turned, and they stayed like that for a long time, in brooding silence, the seconds ticking down on what precious little time remained, and he thought something between them had hardened, not like ice, but like fire, a burning, a cautery. Then the bed covers rustled and the mattress sprang. Next thing he knew, her arms were around him, her face against the back of his neck, all of her clutching him tighter and tighter until he could hardly breathe. My God, he didn't know he could be held like that, enfolded so completely by fathoms of deep-sea pressure, her whole body shaking. Thank you. I'll stop there so that I have some time to show you some photographs and to talk a little bit about the novel. As I was telling the students earlier, one of the inspirations for Josiah Chang is a person named Richard Marr. Richard Marr was the only Chinese Canadian who served in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. And this is a picture of him in England, I'm pretty sure. In any case, I love this image of him in front of the Union Jack. You know, he's got his paratrooping helmet with the scrim camouflage, and he kind of just looks like a superhero to me in this photograph. He looks heroic. This is Richard Marr in his, you can't really tell because it's a black and white photograph, but it's the famed maroon beret that I mentioned in the prologue. This is the symbol of airborne the world over. And you can see his wings actually on his chest. American paratroopers got a silver pin when they got their wings. Canadians got a badge when they got their jump wings. And this is Richard Marr in Camp Bulford in England. Josiah Chang, like Richard Marr, joins the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion in England. There's a long period of waiting and training for D-Day. And for reasons that are unexplained in the historical record, Richard Marr did not actually jump on D-Day as Josiah Chang does. Other Chinese Canadians did serve in the Normandy campaign, so Josiah Chang is a composite of the service of many individuals. But Richard Marr did go on, so the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion served in 3 major campaigns. The first was Normandy, and then the next was the Ardennes Offensive. People may remember that Hitler made one final push to break through the Western Front. He tried to smash his way to Antwerp, and the front line, the Allied front line, it bent but did not break. It bulged. That's why it's called Battle of the Bulge. He was part of the Canadian troops that sort of formed the rear guard, took the place of some Americans and British forces, which were the ones that were chiefly involved in the fighting. The Canadians wound up doing sort of a lot of waiting around and a lot of manning positions in the freezing cold and with under-equipped and not having winter gear and so on and so forth. But it was really the Americans and the British who really took it on the chin in the Ardennes offensive. And he was also part of the final mission in Germany, Operation Varsity, so he jumped as part of the Rhine Drop and was part of the Canadian forces that made their way to Wismar. And as I was telling the students, Josiah Chang, those initials are meant to remind folks of Johnny Canuck. Johnny Canuck is this figure of Canadiana. He's kind of Canada's Uncle Sam or Britain's John Bull. Johnny Canuck is Canada's version of that. And he reemerged, as I alluded to earlier, as a comic book hero during the Second World War, very explicitly fighting fascism. You can see Hitler on the cover of this comic book. And interestingly, he took on various iterations, including, famously, he's a lumberjack, and that's why Josiah Chang is a faller or a lumberjack from the Caribou. But he also took on a wartime persona. He's so famous that he got his own stamp in Canada. And he's not a paratrooper in this case, but he is an aviator. So he's a wartime hero as well in Canadiana. So these were a couple of the inspirations, as I was describing earlier, for the character of Josiah Chang. One front of research, of course, was the war, but the novel is called The Riveter because before he goes off to war, Josiah Chang works as a riveter in a shipyard. He goes to Vancouver, he works as a riveter. And this Canadian wartime poster is actually referenced in the novel. Josiah Chang sees this poster in the shipyard, and he suddenly has a sense of himself as a riveter and what that means. He feels like he's contributing to the war effort. For those who don't know, Chinese Canadians were actually barred from military service shortly after the onset of the war because Chinese Canadians didn't have citizenship in the franchise in Canada. Many Chinese Canadians wanted to fight for citizenship in the franchise, but the Canadian government was afraid of precisely that service would be leveraged for citizenship and voting rights. So a lot of Chinese Canadians went into wartime industries to serve the war effort, and that's one of the reasons why Josiah Chang works in a shipyard before he goes off. There is meant to be a kind of analog between the rivet gun and then the Bren gun, which he later carries. Just the idea that the Bren gun was, I think it was like 27 pounds, was pretty heavy. It was hard to schlep that thing any great distance without some special padding because it was just a really heavy piece of weaponry. And the rivet gun was similar. It was a heavy piece of equipment and typically wielded by sort of the biggest and the strongest. So that's kind of a connection between the riveting and what Josiah does later. One good piece of advice for all of the aspiring writers out there is to not read your Goodreads and Amazon reviews. This is excellent advice. You shouldn't do it. But I do it sometimes. And one thing that I read once was a very short review that just said, "Precious little riveting." Precious little riveting. They wanted more riveting. But I hope they saw the connection between the rivet gun and the Bren gun and understood that there was some continuity there. Don't read your reviews. Don't read your reviews. So, one of the important sources for me was the Vancouver Archives, a really rich trove of photographs. And I think writers, in addition to reading and oral histories and other things, photographs can be really, really important forms of research to allow you to see, right? To imagine your way into a time and place. I think photographs are really important, and this is just an example of the scaffolding that they would build around victory ships to build these what were 10,000 ton, known as 10,000 ton cargo ships. These were ships that were desperately important for the war effort to carry men and material and other supplies to England. 1 in 4 got sunk. 1 in 4 got sunk by German submarines. That is a very, very high casualty rate. Most of us wouldn't take that bargain, right? 1 in 4 chance of dying every time you cross. And there were times when Germans were just, they were just taking out tens of these every month, like 60, 70 of these cargo ships a month. And so there was a desperate need to build more, And that's why in Vancouver, Burrard Dry Dock built a second yard on the south shore of Burrard Inlet. And it was a part of a major mobilization of resources to fight this war. And so, I explained one of the inspirations for Poppy Miller in my interview earlier with Jim. I don't know if I mentioned it in a class, so maybe it's worth mentioning here. I was doing research on a shipyard, and I read about a woman who emerged from a doorway in a shipyard and was shortly followed by a man who emerged from the same doorway, much like in the novel. And it was very clear that something indiscreet or untoward had happened between them behind closed doors. And this was at a time where there was pretty strict gender segregation in shipyards. There were lots of rules about modesty, female modesty. Women had to have their hair, in a bandana or some kind of hat, ostensibly for safety, but really it was about modesty. And women had to eat in a separate lunchroom. It was, basically men and women were not supposed to commingle, right, in these workspaces for fear of precisely this kind of thing, which, rare as it was something that people were afraid of. And so it was interesting to me that there was a woman who had this kind of daring, right, this kind of sense of sexual freedom and sexual daring, and who could defy the conventions and the mores of the time. And that was maybe the first spark for the character of Poppy Miller. But I also saw this picture. I think this woman's name is Miss Hetty Brunkel, or Brunkel, maybe, Hetty Brunkel. And she's a jitney driver. Jitney was kind of, it was kind of a jerry-rigged sort of vehicle, somewhere between like a soapbox car and on a Jeep chassis. And the first time we're introduced to Poppy Miller in the novel, the line is, the first time he saw her, she was driving a jitney. And so this photograph might have been the reason I made Poppy a jitney driver. And people ask about research, and I first started working on this novel 2014-15 when I was on fellowship in England. And I was there for 10 months. And that's when I wrote the first fledgling pages of the novel. And again, speaking to all of the aspiring writers out there, all those pages I wrote in England and the years afterwards, I eventually wound up throwing out and starting the novel all over again. And that is, it's just what it's what it's like to be a writer. So don't be surprised if you reach that crossroads and you just especially when you work on a project for a long time, the very act of writing makes you a different writer, hopefully a better writer, and you become, of course, a different person over the course of time, right? And so just you get to a point where you look back and you say, well, I'm not the person who wrote those pages. I'm not happy with those anymore. And it was really at that point when I wrote the opening pages I just read to you, the iteration that the novel, this particular iteration of the novel, but I threw out everything I wrote in England and things that I worked on for many years after. But in any case, when I was in England, I discovered that there was something called the Wallace Shipbuilder. This is the house organ for Burrard Dry Dock in Vancouver. They published a monthly newsletter in the shipyard talking about all the comings and goings of shipyard life, and there's everything in the Wallace Shipbuilder from like bingo nights to, you know, hockey scores to bowling league results to a whole series on how victory ships were built, you know? Super useful information to someone who doesn't know anything about wartime shipbuilding. The problem was I was in England, you know, and I emailed the Vancouver Archives and I said, can you scan every page of the Wallace Shipbuilder from 1943 to 1945 and send it to me? And they did. You know, that's what a good archive will do for a writer, you know, is come through like that. But it was amazing. I have like month after month of the Wallace Shipbuilder, and just a lot of stuff was gleaned from, you know, it's amazing, right, to have like a contemporaneous account of shipyard life, right? It's just an amazing resource, not something you're ever going to find in a book written after the fact. And of course, I had to do a lot of research into, you know, paratrooping, and these are Canadians who are training in England. You can see the Nissen hut in the back. They're wearing weird looking training helmets at the moment. When Canadians went down to Fort Benning, Canada didn't have a jump school at the outset of the war. Canadians in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion first trained in Fort Benning, Georgia. They wore Rydell helmets. Basically, they were converted football helmets when they were training. Something that I mentioned in the book, but for the uninitiated, when Canadians learned to jump in Fort Benning, they jumped out of C-47s, which are spacious planes, and you jump out of a side door. And it's spacious enough when you go out that side door that they could wear a backup chute in front. So if the parachute doesn't deploy, you can pull the ripcord and your backup chute. You have a backup chute. But you know, much to their dismay, when Canadians got to England, they had to learn to jump the British way. The British did not have C-47s. They only had converted bombers, like Whitleys and Albemarles. And these were small planes, cramped planes. As you can see, it's not particularly spacious. On a C-47, you can sit down, you can go to the bathroom, and that's not the case in a plane like this. And then they had to jump through the hatch in the floor where the belly turret had been removed. So that's how they had to go out, not out a side door, but through the floor of the plane where the belly turret had been removed. And it was too small to safely wear that backup chute, too small to go through with the backup chute and a pack on your back. So to jump the British way meant you didn't have a backup chute anymore, didn't have a backup. But the British jumped lower anyways, so a backup chute wouldn't have really helped, because you would have been dead anyways if your parachute didn't deploy in time. But as the novel also suggests, that this opening is not very big, and if you didn't jump through properly, and if your pack caught the lip, you would flip forward. And many men broke their noses because their pack would hit the back of the hatch, and they would flip them, and they would go headfirst into the other side. I love this photograph. This is a moment that's kind of referenced in the novel. Canadian troops being inspected by the royal family. I love a shy-looking Princess Elizabeth in the background there, in her Peter Pan collar and lampshade hat. But the Canadians were wondering when they were going to finally be able to make the final assault on Europe. And it was when they were inspected by the royal family, and they were not allowed to jump, even though there were all these kinds of displays for the royal family. They weren't allowed to jump. Then they knew that the moment was at hand, because they didn't want anyone to get injured, right, through some kind of display jump. So that's when they knew, okay, the moment is at hand. We're gonna go to war soon. And this is a photograph, I believe, of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. right before D-Day, waiting to enplane, I think. Yeah, you can see the helmets. You can see the scrim camouflage, right? All that scrim camouflage on their helmets, things that are described in the novel. And I mentioned to the students earlier that, as I mentioned just now, that Canadians went down to Fort Benning, and this is a photograph of Fort Benning, Eubanks Field during the Second World War. But my in-laws live in the panhandle of Florida. So one time when my family and I went to see them, I drove up to Fort Benning, and I took a look at those jump towers myself. They are still in Eubanks Field in Fort Benning, 250-foot jump towers from which men are dropped in their parachutes to practice landings. Those jump towers are still standing in Fort Benning. And I also went to the National Infantry Museum in Columbus, Georgia. And they have something called Company Street. And Company Street is a reconstruction of a World War II street using the actual buildings and mess halls and churches and such from the time. So when I describe, for example, the barracks at Fort Benning and what they look like and so on, and the single large shower stall for all the men, and the single row of toilets without partitions, which I have spared you a photograph of. I describe those things because I saw them. I saw them myself when I walked through Company Street. So my research is a combination of reading books, digging through the archives, looking at photographs, and whenever possible, seeing firsthand things myself. So I'll stop there and open things up for questions.
Hey, Charisse.
Hi. I had wondered, I wasn't familiar with your work when I came, and I was wondering when you started if it was about D-Day. And my grandfather was a young lieutenant on D-Day, and he was airborne, and he was actually awarded the Silver Star for his performance on D-Day. And I often wondered about the plane, and you captured that so well when you said the human tincture, I think you used that word, and the bad breath and the body odor, and it's like, and the smell of cigarettes. I mean, it was, so prevalent.
Right.
And I also served in the 401st Airborne in the Civil Affairs Battalion in Tonawanda, which is a suburb of Buffalo. I never jumped because, when I was in AIT, the Persian Gulf War ended, but I was supposed to jump. The funding when you're not in war kind of limits, because that training is very expensive. But thank you, because I always wondered about the fear on that day, and you captured something for me. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your service. Thank you to your grandfather for his service. As a writer, any act of imagination, and there's a moment in the novel where I suggest as much. Any act of imagination can only pale, of course, to the actual experience and the actual fear and terror of moments like that. And when we use the word in literature and writing, when we use the word appropriation, I think we often talk in terms of race, or we talk in terms of gender and what's permissible to write and not write. But I did feel very much that this was a kind of appropriation to be someone who is not a veteran, to write about being a soldier, And so this is all a way of saying that I took seriously the responsibility of trying to capture those experiences, and I can only hope that I did it some justice. Thank you.
I appreciate
Right.
And the green berets are also there.
Right. Right.
Sorry. So it was so intimidating because I was the first unit. We were civil affairs, and we were a new, rising type of job.
Right. Right.
And they had never at Fort Bragg ever had an AIT unit there.
Right.
So we were the only ones without the berets.
Yeah. Right.
We felt very amateurish amongst all those soldiers.
Right. Right. Yeah. There was, that symbol carries a lot of cachet. The Canadians really loved the American jump boots. Canadians had these black boots that only had 6 eyelets. The Americans had these brown boots that had 12 eyelets. They went halfway up the calf kind of thing. Oh yeah, yeah, that's amazing. I was recently at a war museum in East Point, Florida, again visiting my in-laws, and saw a pair of those brown American jump boots, and yeah, they were pretty neat to see.
Matt's got a question.
When it comes to doing this much research for a novel like this, how do you decide what to stick to historically and what not to, and what facts to include and what not?
Yeah, that's a great question. On the one hand, you can learn a lot about the real exploits of the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion if you read the Riveter. And I wanted, on the one hand, to hew to the contours of their missions, and give a true sense of what that unit accomplished. At the same time, I'm not writing a history, right? And there's a reason I am writing about Josiah Chang and not trying to write a work of nonfiction about Richard Marr. It's because I wanted the liberty to imagine. And so sometimes you conflate things, sometimes you will elide things, omit things, right? For the purposes of drama, for the purpose of, narrative, right? And I think the great danger of writing historical fiction is that you're going to get lost in the interestingness of too much information. Like you read stuff and it's just like, oh, this is interesting, and this is interesting, and that is interesting, and I want to get this in and get that in, right? And 2 things I would say is, one is that, in the first draft, maybe just write whatever you think is interesting and useful. But I think in revision, those subsequent drafts, I think you will see what is essential to the drama, to the narrative, and what was just perhaps, your own fascination with a tidbit. You know what I mean? You'll start to see the difference in revision between information and drama. And the other thing, and I mentioned this to Jim earlier, is I heard a writer say once that when they do research, they don't write anything down. And then what they remember later is what matters. So if you note take, for example, you'll probably wind up writing, right, just endless amounts of interesting stuff. But maybe it's really what sticks in your memory that matters. So that might be a useful piece of advice, yeah, if you're thinking about doing this kind of research-based writing. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Hi. I have kind of a craft question.
Sure.
There seems to be schools of kind of competing schools of thought about prologues, epilogues, so on. I don't, forgive me if you talked about this already in the class, but I was wondering if you could talk about your prologue and the decisions that you made as a writer to do that, because I know they often tell their own little story, and I just want to hear your thinking. Thank you.
That's a good question, because I actually have some reservations about whether or not I should have called it a prologue at all, and whether or not I should have just called it part 1. In some ways, it's not really ultimately that material to the story, because I think this structurally would have unfolded the same way. But I start, D-Day is definitely in medias res. It's, it's in the middle of things. As a general principle, I think stories should start at the latest possible moment. And, every writer has to figure out how late can that moment be, but you're trying to start at the latest possible moment. And so this is pretty late, right? And I also talk about, as I mentioned to the students, acute and chronic tensions and starting in a moment where you're introducing both the immediate problem and the long-standing problem. That's why you have, of course, D-Day on the one hand, but then the backstory, the relationship on the other, right? The intersection of those two things. And this particular opening, as I alluded to earlier, there was a point where I was very dissatisfied with everything that I wrote, and I was dissatisfied with the way this story began, and I just said I wanted to write an opening that people that would find hard to put down. And there's almost like no more dramatic moment that one could come up with, right, than D-Day. And then the novel works backward in time and comes back up to D-Day and beyond. And the novel actually went through many iterations. At first, it vacillated between these two timelines with great frequency, between war and everything before the war. It was frequent vacillations. And then people told me, editor suggested it was perhaps confusing, so I made those alternations less frequent. Some people thought it was still confusing, and so I came up with the current structure, which is basically just moving the Normandy campaign forward, and everything else is pretty much chronological. It's just kind of Normandy that gets moved forward in two chunks. And I called it a prologue, but I do wonder if maybe it's just D-Day is so integral to the story, it's not prefatory at all. It should have just been part one, should have just been part one. But in any case, my goal was to hold the reader's attention and to start as late as possible and to introduce what was at stake in the story as soon as possible. So regardless of whether it was a prologue or part one, those were my goals. But I am curious, the students who read this, because I've heard people say, again, don't read your reviews. I do, but I heard people say, I liked it, but the chronology was a bit confusing to me. And to me, it was just like, especially after like simplifying it so many times to the point where it's just like a couple of alternations, right? In time, I am curious if it was confusing. The chronology was confusing. You can tell me afterwards. You can tell me afterwards if you want. But I am curious if people still find the chronology confusing, because it is radically simplified from what I attempted originally. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Okay, great.
I wanted to ask, in the whole process of writing the book and like putting it together, what was the hardest part and what was the easiest for you?
Hardest part and the easiest part. That's a really good question. I guess there's maybe two parts to the hardest part question. So I am the poster child for the late bloomer. I first aspired to write when I was, like many of you, an undergraduate. And I didn't publish We Two Alone, my first book, until I was 48 years old. Well past the time that, common sense told me to quit. And, but in all that time, I was just writing, and the world was not waiting for my work. Like there wasn't under deadline, like, there was nobody waiting for my work. I was working on, and at one point I was working on these two books simultaneously, and, but nobody was waiting for that first story collection. So I was just kind of like writing at the pace that allowed me to produce what I felt was my best possible work. But when I sold my short story collection, and I also mentioned this earlier, I also sold the novel on a partial. And then suddenly, I was under deadline. Like, this was a new experience for me as a writer, to be under deadline when I had worked for basically 30 years just trying to produce a book that I was happy with, and suddenly I was under deadline. That's a very different experience, for a writer. And it was in the process of writing this novel that I came to the point where I realized I had to throw out years of work, and that was probably the hardest part. But it was also a function of that deadline, because I realized that I was trying to write a 1,000-page novel that I would never finish. Or rather, I could have finished if I had taken the Kiran Desai plan. She just got shortlisted for the Booker, but she was 20 years between books. 20 years between books. If I had not signed a 2-book deal, just a 1-book deal, then maybe I would have taken 20 years to write the 1,000-page novel, the 800-page novel. But I think the pressure of the deadline and my own dissatisfaction with old writing, it came to a point where it's like, this is not good enough. I got to throw it out. That's probably the hardest point. I don't know if anything about writing for me is easy. Anything about writing this novel is easy, but I did come to a point where I got to the end, and I just knew what I had to do. I was at a residency in Vancouver, and I'd basically just wake up in the morning, go to the computer, write, stop to eat some leftover Chinese food, write, stop to eat some more leftover Chinese food for dinner, write, go to sleep, and repeat for weeks on end. At the end, when it was sort of just downhill, and I just knew I had to finish, and I knew how I wanted to finish. The end of the novel for me is relatively unrevised, whereas everything usually is just, gets revised endlessly. So in that sense, maybe the ending was the easiest part, although nothing about it was particularly easy, or maybe the easiest. Does that answer your question?
During your research, how did you go about deciding what pieces of history you were going to use from the archive and what pieces you were not going to use?
Yeah, part of the reason I think that I was telling the students a story about special operations executive, which I won't repeat, but there was this other Chinese Canadian by the name of Douglas Sam. He flew bombers for No. 6 Bomber Command. So he flew sorties over France and Germany, did dozens of these until he was shot down over France. And he survived the crash. He joined the French resistance. He helped repel a German attack. He was awarded a medal by the French government. This is interesting stuff, right? This is interesting stuff. And very little known history. This Chinese Canadian who was a bomber pilot and all the rest. And, when I wanted the novel to be the Riveters, I really wanted to capture a few of these storylines. Part of me still rues the fact that I didn't write an iteration of this story that could capture all of these. But at some point I realized that, I could not go down every rabbit hole of interestingness, And I think that happens at a micro level as well, So yes, I'm capturing this. Let me give you an example. So there's this painfully ironic moment at the end where after the Canadians survive everything and the Germans surrender, Canadian goes swimming and he dies, right? To make it through the war and then die, what a horribly tragic fate, right? I got that in the novel. And then something else that happened was on the voyage back, there was some mishap with a gun and some somebody got shot, you know? Same thing, right? Tragic fate. You make it all the way through the war, and you die on the voyage home, right? And I was trying to like shoehorn these things into the novel, and then I just realized, well, I only need this to happen once. I don't need it. I don't need to make the point twice, right? I don't need to make the point twice. And so too often when you read a history, like when I'm telling this to you, it's interesting, right? Like there's interestingness to it. But at some point you have to, as a writer, you have to say, well, what's really serving the drama, right? What's really serving the narrative arc? And then when the voyage back is those of you who read it recall, it's very quick, right? Like they're on the Ile de France, and it takes way longer than the Queen Elizabeth, because it's much slower, but it takes them 3 weeks. But it's a summary, because at that point the narrative doesn't demand that you slow down and talk about all these things. The reader is eager for Josiah to get back to Poppy. So the reader isn't demanding it at that point, all these little side stories about cosmic irony and what have you, right? So so you just have to think about what is serving the what is propelling the narrative. Yeah.
Hey. I'm Korean American, and I grew up in the 1980s, and I was always wondering as a kid, when is someone going to write a story where someone who is, I'll just say, Asian North American is going to be able to be a hero, and could that hero be somebody that across culture would translate?
Right.
I would be amazed by like celebrating Martin Luther King Day and all these other kind of big public events, and then we had these big, larger-than-life, almost mythical characters. And I wonder if you felt any like pressure or any kind of responsibility to try to craft that kind of character when there really aren't a lot, and before like the mania of like K-pop demon hunters and all that stuff happening right now. Like when I grew up, like I had to tell the people on the school bus that I was from Korea, and they said it wasn't a real country. So like I'm just wondering, like, for your experience of the 30 years and all the work that you were doing, kind of what kind of story you wanted to tell and how Josiah becomes that character.
Yeah, thanks for that question. Again, I'm sorry to keep referring to the class, but I asked the class how many people were aware that 20,000 Chinese Americans had also served in the Second World War, and most were not aware that 20,000 Chinese Americans or Americans of Chinese descent had served, a full 40% of whom didn't have citizenship. I think these are underappreciated stories, and part of the reason I wanted to tell this story is in the 80 years since VE Day, since the end of the war, I don't think there's a single piece of a long-form narrative in the form of fiction or nonfiction, fiction, a novel or memoir, about Chinese Canadian who served. There's just, it was a very self-effacing generation. I think in general the greatest generation tend to be more self-effacing than we are, right? These days, like, you do anything, you're just like, I'm going to go write a book, right? I'm going to write a book. And I don't think the greatest generation was like that. I think they tended to be more self-effacing, but Chinese Canadians in particular, I think, were a self-effacing generation. They didn't talk about their service. They didn't talk about what they did. And so it seemed to me time to tell that story. But to your point, I was sort of talking about this again earlier, and just the idea that Josiah Chang is a little bit of a heroic sort of figure. I mean, he's heroic by virtue of just being a guy who served in the 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. Like Richard Marr, like you're looking at a guy who seems heroic to me, right? Just because he served and was selected for such an elite unit. But I also wanted to depict somebody who was strong and capable and able in many ways to challenge the prevailing image of Asian males in the popular imaginary. These days it's different, because I think there are many more positive, multifaceted depictions of Asians and, in general, and Asian males in particular. There's not the dearth that I felt when I was a kid, of images, reflections of myself that made me feel good about myself, And so in some ways, I am still of that generation that lived through that dearth and still feels the need to present Asian males in a different light, And so in many ways, the fact that Josiah Chang is strong and able and joins this battalion and stuff, it is meant to, because some people see him as sort of like almost larger than life and, and maybe almost unrealistic. But I think it's part of the very deliberate challenge of the way Asian American, or Asian males in general, Asian North American, as you say, have been depicted in the popular imaginary. Yeah.
Is it time for book signing? Ready to sign some books? Okay, thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry? Oh, yeah, I do. I do. Starting to feel a little warm in here. Should I sit here? I'm going to get